The strangest part about moving from America to England was not the food or the weather or the way British people talk about a 20-minute train delay like civilization has collapsed. It was sitting in a movie theatre in Leicester Square and realizing my brain was doing something it had done in every theatre back home for years. I was scanning the room for exits, I was checking the aisles, I was quietly calculating where I would run if somebody stood up and started shooting, and then it hit me. I do not have to do that here. That realization landed so hard it almost took the air out of me. But what is really crazy is that this whole identity crisis about safety did not start in a theatre. It started with a plug socket in my apartment wall. I am American and I have been living in the UK for a little over a year now. Before I moved, I genuinely believed America was the gold standard for staying safe. We have gated neighborhoods, ring cameras, alarm systems, giant SUVs built like tanks, and a whole cultural obsession with self-protection. We refrigerate everything, we sanitize everything, we lock everything, we arm everything, we treat daily life like a low-grade siege, and because we do it all the time, it starts to feel normal. Then I moved to England, and one by one, those assumptions started collapsing. The first thing that broke my brain was the British electrical plug. If you grew up in America and you have ever seen one of these things for the first time, you probably had the same reaction I did. Why is this thing so huge? Why does it look like a medieval torture device? Why is it built like it expects to survive a direct artillery strike? American plugs look elegant by comparison, two flat little pins, maybe a third if you are feeling fancy, and that is it. The British plug looks like somebody took a normal charger and said no, make it bulkier, heavier, and twice as likely to destroy a foot at 2 in the morning. I hated them immediately. Then I learned what they were actually designed to do, and I felt like an idiot. British plugs are considered by a lot of engineers to be the safest plugs in the world, and the reason comes from the kind of practical paranoia that grows out of a country rebuilding itself after a war. After World War II, Britain had a serious copper shortage. In America, homes were wired in a way that used more copper because each outlet effectively ran back through its own path to the breaker. Britain could not afford to keep building that way, so they created the ring main system. Instead of individual lines branching out, the electrical wiring ran in a loop around the house. It saved copper, but it also meant more current could be available at any single outlet, which made faults more dangerous. And honestly, this is the part of moving abroad that I don't think I can fully explain in one video. Because yes, there are the obvious differences, the plugs, the food, the healthcare, all of that. But then there's the emotional side of it, the strange little moments where you realize you've been carrying fear in your body for years and you never even noticed it until it finally disappears. And those are the kinds of conversations I usually get way deeper into with the people who support this channel directly. So if you like these more personal, layered videos, and you want the deeper stories, the behind-the-scenes thoughts, and the stuff I probably can't always fit into the main uploads, you can join the channel membership below. It genuinely helps me make more of these videos, and it lets me share a little more openly with the people who are really invested in this journey with me. And now, once I started noticing that feeling of safety in one part of life, I started seeing it everywhere. So the British solved that problem in the most British way possible. They engineered around human stupidity. Every plug has its own fuse built directly into it. Your hairdryer has one, your lamp has one, your toaster has one. If something goes wrong, the plug sacrifices itself before the appliance turns into a house fire. That alone would be impressive, but it gets better. On an American socket, the holes are just there. In Britain, the top pin on the plug is longer than the other two. That pin is the earth, and it goes in first. The live and neutral slots are blocked by internal shutters, and those shutters do not open until the longer earth pin unlocks them. Unless you are using an actual plug, the socket stays closed. Then there is the little detail that really embarrassed me. The lower parts of the live and neutral pins are insulated, so if the plug is halfway in and your finger brushes against it, you hit plastic, not energized metal. In America, that exact same mistake can get you shocked. In Britain, the design assumes you are going to be careless at some point and protects you anyway. That was the moment I started feeling uncomfortable because I realized something ugly. In America, we talk about freedom as if safety features are annoying little obstacles. We like sleek designs, we like convenience. But once you see the British system up close, you start wondering whether our idea of convenience is sometimes just a prettier version of avoidable danger. and that same feeling hit me again in the bathroom. For the first few months I lived here, I could not get over the separate taps. One side is freezing cold, the other side is hot enough to remove a layer of skin. There is no mixer, there is no pleasant middle ground. It feels absurd. I assumed it was just old-fashioned design, but the real explanation is much darker. In older British homes, cold water came straight from the mains. That was the clean drinking water. Hot water often came from a storage tank in the attic, and historically those tanks were not sealed the way modern systems are. Dirt could get in, insects could get in, and in the worst stories, dead animals could get in too. If you had a mixer tap connecting dirty stored hot water with the clean main supply, there was a theoretical risk of contamination backing into the drinking water system. So Britain treated the problem with the seriousness of a country that had lived through cholera outbreaks and Victorian public health disasters. Separate the systems, keep the safe water protected. Build the caution directly into the architecture. Modern boilers are much better, and plenty of new homes do have mixer taps, but the cultural memory never really disappeared. That is why so many British sinks still feel like artifacts from another century. They are reminders that convenience lost an argument with contamination, and contamination was not allowed to win. By this point, I was already rethinking what safety even meant. But then I went grocery shopping. The first time I walked into Tesco looking for eggs, I did what every American would do. I went to the refrigerated section. I checked near the milk. I checked near the butter. I checked again, because clearly I had missed them. I finally asked an employee, and he pointed to a normal shelf in the middle of the store. The eggs were just sitting there at room temperature. To an American, that looks insane. We have been trained to see unrefrigerated eggs as a public health disaster waiting to happen. But Britain and America solved the salmonella problem in opposite ways. In America, commercial eggs are washed aggressively. They go through hot water and chemical sanitizing because the system assumes contamination is likely and the shell needs to be cleaned. But that process strips away the egg's natural outer coating, the cuticle, which is basically a built-in protective shield. Once that layer is gone, the shell becomes more vulnerable and the egg has to be refrigerated to stay safe. In Britain and much of Europe, the logic is reversed. Do not destroy the egg, and then fix the egg. Fix the conditions that made the egg risky in the first place. So instead of depending on post-processing, the system focuses more on flock health, vaccination, and prevention. The cuticle stays intact, the shell keeps doing the job nature designed it to do, and the egg can sit on a shelf without causing a national panic attack. That one difference sent me down a much bigger rabbit hole, because once you start asking why one country trusts the product and the other one has to sanitize it into submission, you start noticing the same split everywhere. Bread was the next thing that got under my skin. In America, you can find commercial bread products made with additives that other countries would rather not mess with. In Britain, the regulatory mindset is harsher. If there is reason to think an additive could be harmful, the default answer is often closer to prove it is safe first. That is a completely different philosophy from the one a lot of Americans grow up with. Back home, the burden often feels like it lands on the consumer. Read the label, do your own research, figure out what that chemical does, decide whether you are okay eating it for the next decade. You become your own regulator because the system has quietly delegated that responsibility to you. In the United States, I used to read ingredient lists with the energy of a private investigator trying to crack a conspiracy. In Britain, that low-level anxiety just eased off. I still read labels sometimes, obviously, but I am not fighting the same background feeling that the burden is entirely on me. Then there are the colors. American junk food is almost fluorescent. A strawberry soda in the States can look like it came from a chemistry set. The same flavor in Britain often looks far more subdued, and a lot of that comes down to regulation and public pressure. Once warning labels and stricter standards enter the chat, companies suddenly remember that fruit and vegetable concentrates exist. That may sound small, but it changes your relationship with food. Grocery shopping stops feeling like a permanent negotiation between convenience, nostalgia, and mild fear. You stop needing to be on guard every second, and that word guard kept following me everywhere, because the real moment England made me question everything about safety had nothing to do with sockets or sinks or eggs. It had to do with what it feels like to simply be out in public. That night in the movie theatre was not an isolated incident. It was an exposed nerve. I realized I had been carrying around a level of vigilance that felt normal only because I had never lived without it. In America, a lot of us have habits we do not even notice anymore. You enter a building and clock the exits. You mentally note where cover might be. Children do active shooter drills in schools. Parents talk about classroom doors and escape routes. You go to a concert or a mall or a grocery store, and there is always, somewhere deep in your mind, a tiny whisper asking whether today is the day something unthinkable becomes ordinary again. The horrifying part is how routine that whisper becomes. In Britain, that whisper got quieter almost immediately. Not because crime does not exist here. It does. Not because danger vanished. It did not. But because one category of catastrophic violence is simply not hovering over everyday life in the same way. And to understand why, you end up back at one of the darkest turning points in modern British history. In 1996, a gunman entered a primary school in Dunblane, Scotland, and murdered 16 children and their teacher. It was one of those events that tears a hole in a country. The sort of thing that forces a national decision about what matters more, preserving a private hobby or making sure this never happens again. Britain made that decision fast. There was outrage, there was public pressure, there were petitions, and then there was legislation that effectively banned private handgun ownership in mainland Britain. That did not erase violence, it did not create utopia, but it changed the baseline reality people live inside. That matters more than Americans like to admit. Anytime you bring this up in the United States, somebody will jump in with the same talking point. Fine, they will say, but what about knife crime? London is a war zone. I used to believe versions of that too, because American media has pushed that story so hard that it almost functions like emotional self-defense. If Britain is secretly just as dangerous, then we do not have to question our own choices. But the reason that comparison falls apart is simple. A society without widespread guns is not a society without violence. It is a society where the scale, speed, and distance of violence changes dramatically. That changes what public life feels like. It changes how likely a random argument, a school day, a cinema trip, or a parade is to turn into mass casualty horror in a matter of seconds. You feel that absence in your body. I feel it walking at night too, and I do not say that lightly. I am a woman. In America, walking alone after dark meant a whole choreography of self-protection. Pepper spray in the bag, keys between the fingers, music off, head on a swivel. Every parked car becomes suspicious. Every footstep behind you gets a little too loud. In Britain, I still stay aware. I am not stupid, and this is not a fairy tale. But the equation is different when the possibility of a gun being involved is massively reduced. Fear does not disappear. It just stops feeling industrialized. What is fascinating is that Britain balances that lower risk with something that used to unsettle me for a completely different reason. Cameras. London is covered in CCTV. The first time I really clocked how many there were, my American brain immediately started yelling about Orwell and surveillance and the end of privacy. But when you ask British people about it, the reaction is often closer to a shrug. The logic is practical. The cameras are there to deter, document, and help solve crimes quickly. If something happens in a dense city, there is a decent chance investigators can follow a suspect from one angle to the next. This is one of those moments where my American instincts still resist the conclusion, but real life keeps arguing with them. I was raised to believe that visible surveillance automatically meant less freedom. Yet what I actually experienced here was that I gave up a slice of theoretical anonymity and got back something more tangible in return, which was a stronger sense that public disorder would not simply vanish into the dark with no witness. That same trade-off shows up in policing. If you grow up in America, you learn very early that police encounters can turn deadly with terrifying speed. Even if you have never personally had a bad interaction, the choreography is burned into the culture. Hands visible, move slowly, narrate every motion, keep the tone respectful, because everybody understands that a gun is in the conversation before anybody says a word. Then you come to Britain and realize the average police officer on the street does not carry a firearm. The first time I saw that, I honestly thought I had misunderstood something, but for routine policing, the visible vibe is completely different. High visibility jackets, regular conversation. Officers who look like they expect to spend more time talking than drawing a weapon. That changes the emotional temperature of the interaction. The philosophy behind British policing has historically leaned on this idea of consent. that police legitimacy comes from public trust rather than a display of overwhelming force. Britain does have armed units, obviously, and serious threats get serious responses. But the default image of authority on the street is not a person dressed for urban warfare. Watching officers deal with drunk, chaotic people outside pubs was bizarrely educational for me. There was still conflict, there was still yelling, but there was far more talking, more patience, more negotiation than my American nervous system expected. When neither side assumes that a firearm might enter the scene at any second, the whole encounter tends to start at a lower temperature. And then there is crossing the road, which sounds trivial until you realize it exposes a completely different moral system. In America, jaywalking is treated like you are interfering with the true owner of the street, which is the car. You wait for the signal, you wait for permission. If you cross at the wrong time, even on an empty road, you are the one behaving irresponsibly. I came to Britain and stood obediently at a crossing with no cars anywhere in sight, waiting for the little green man like a schoolchild. Meanwhile, elderly women, office workers, and teenagers strolled straight across the road without the slightest hint of guilt. I remember thinking, are all of you about to get fined? But jaywalking, as Americans understand it, is not really a thing here. The expectation is different. Pedestrians have more freedom to use their own judgment. Drivers are expected to treat people as part of the road environment, not as intruders who have violated the sacred flow of traffic. That sounds like a tiny difference in legal culture, but it reflects a much bigger one. American infrastructure often makes you feel that the human body is the least important object on the street. British roads, with all their narrow lanes, weird curves, roundabouts, and traffic calming features, often communicate the opposite. Slow down, pay attention. There are people here. When you pair that with less gun anxiety, less militarized policing, and a city design that does not worship speed quite as aggressively, you begin to feel something I did not know I had been missing. Public space starts to belong to the public again. And then, just when I thought I had processed the emotional difference between these two countries, I got hurt. I was chopping vegetables in my kitchen, the knife slipped, and I sliced my hand badly enough that the bleeding would not stop. In America, that kind of accident triggers two forms of panic at once. First, you panic about the injury, then, almost instantly, you panic about the bill. Where do I go? Is urgent care open? Is this hospital in network? Will they call this emergency treatment or something else? Am I about to pay an absurd amount of money because I lost a fight with a bell pepper? That second layer of fear is so normal in the United States that we barely even discuss how bizarre it is. We have built a society where physical pain and financial dread arrive as a package deal. So my husband drove me to A&E in London. I gave my name, I sat down, I waited a long time, because yes, the NHS absolutely has wait time problems, and Brits will complain about them constantly. But when they finally called me in, a nurse cleaned the wound, stitched it, gave me a tetanus shot, bandaged my hand, and sent me home. And I remember standing there afterward feeling weirdly confused, like I was missing a step in the ritual. Do I sign something? Do I pay someone? Do I need to show a card? Am I about to get a terrifying invoice in the mail? No, I just left. I walked out into the night and had the same reaction I had in that movie theater. My body released something I had been carrying for years, because once again I realized that a fear I thought was just part of adulthood was actually part of a system. That is the biggest thing England has taught me about safety. Safety is not just locks, alarms, and personal vigilance. It is not just what you carry in your bag or what app you install on your phone. Real safety is structural. It is designed. It is boring. It lives in plumbing regulations, plug fuses, vaccination policy, street layouts, police culture, food standards, and whether breaking your hand also means breaking your bank account. America tends to individualize everything. Protect yourself. Research your own food. Guard your own kids. Watch your own back. Own your own weapon. Fight your own insurance company. Survive on your own terms. If something goes wrong, we act like the prepared person was smart and the unprepared person was naive. Britain, for all its flaws, and there are plenty, often approaches safety from the opposite direction. The question is not just how a careful person can avoid harm. The question is how the system can reduce harm before it ever reaches that person in the first place. That difference gets under your skin. Once you feel it, it is hard to stop noticing it. I still love America. This is not one of those smug expatriate monologues where somebody moves abroad and suddenly pretends they never liked home. America has energy, generosity, creativity, and a scale of ambition that can be intoxicating. But living in England has forced me to admit that a lot of what I once called freedom was actually a very expensive form of insecurity. Freedom is not having to inspect every room for an exit strategy. Freedom is not wondering whether your bread needs a chemistry degree to decode. Freedom is not paying a financial ransom for stitches. Freedom is being able to move through ordinary life without constantly managing risks that a functioning society could have reduced for you. So now, when I look at those giant, ugly British plugs sticking out of my walls, I do not roll my eyes anymore. I see a philosophy. I see a country that stared at danger, accepted inconvenience, and decided the better design was the one that protected the dumbest, busiest, most distracted person in the room. Once that idea gets into your head, it starts changing everything. Then you look at the eggs, the taps, the roads, the cameras, the police, the hospital, the theatre, and you realize these are not random quirks. They are all pieces of the same argument. Safety is not something you buy for yourself after the fact. The safest societies are the ones that build it in before you even know you need it.